JBS presents the Hampton Synagogue's Author Discussion Series with Rabbi Avraham Bronstein.
My name is Glenn Dorskin. Welcome to the Hampton Synagogue. The Hampton Synagogue Author Discussion Series is a cultural highlight of our summer season, both from members of our congregation and our many visitors from across the Hamptons. I am proud to serve as series chair, and it is my great pleasure to share our past season with you, our global congregation, in celebration of Jewish Book Month. Please welcome Julie Satow to the Hampton.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just read the first 2 pages of the book. It's the prologue, so it's a bit of a shortened version of the first 2 pages. As ice gathered several inches thick on the Hudson River and the mercury plummeted below freezing, Hortense Odlum stepped from her chauffeured car onto the Fifth Avenue sidewalk. Gripping her felt hat to her auburn updo, she stared at the Art Deco skyscraper looming above her, at the 2-story entryway made of filigreed glass and bronze, and the words Bonwit Teller etched prominently into the limestone facade. A morning rush of passers-by leaned against the gale, men lugging briefcases as they trudged toward glass-walled boardrooms, and women in nubby woolen coats ready for a day serving coffee and taking stenography. It was the height of the Great Depression, but even the ranks of the jobless seemed purposeful, huddling against the tall buildings to shield themselves from the biting cold, their bare hands outstretched in the hopes of a Christmas coin. Hortense pulled her fur coat around her and stepped gingerly through the revolving doors. At once, the scramble and blizzard outside fell away as an atmosphere of hushed grandeur and a blast of warm air enveloped her. She looked about the store's main floor, with its maze of glass counters and mirrored columns, the clacking of high heels against marble echoing through the vast space as a handful of early morning shoppers wandered the aisles. Eyeing the bank of elevators sitting along the far wall, Hortense walked toward them, clasping her purse nervously as she asked the operator for the 11th floor. She exited into a reception area, behind which were a series of doors where Bonwit Teller's management had its offices. The secretary showed her to a nearby couch. Moments later, an elderly gentleman, dressed nattily in a 3-piece suit with a shock of silver hair, stuck his head from behind one of the large wooden doors and waved her inside. Paul Bonwit, the 70-year-old merchant, gestured for Hortense to sit across from his imposing presidential desk, and she took her seat with a small, polite smile. Mr. Bonwit, who had come from Germany in his youth and founded his store 4 decades earlier, had spent countless hours charming wealthy housewives with his old-world manners and continental accent. Bonwit Teller had been one of New York's most exclusive, well-appointed department stores. But 3 years into the Great Depression, its rows of mink coats and shelves of baccarat glass sat unsold, and teetering on the cusp of bankruptcy, Mr. Bonwit had been forced to sell. The new owner, Floyd Odlum, was a Wall Street tycoon and one of America's richest men. So far, Mr. Bonwit had managed to keep Floyd at bay, holding on to his large carpeted office and his position as store president. But now Floyd's wife had made a sudden appearance, and Mr. Bonwit was confounded by the arrival of this 41-year-old stay-at-home mother of 2. He had little way of knowing that Hortense's inexperience belied an instinctive business acumen, that by the following year their roles would reverse, with Hortense occupying the corner office at Bonwit Teller, sitting at the stately desk as her secretary took dictation, supervising more than 1,000 employees and directing a store that boasted record-breaking sales. Hortense was setting herself up on a path that would thrust her into a career that she had never intended, that would challenge her notions of womanhood and force her to confront difficult truths. It was the start of a journey that would lay the groundwork for an evolution of the grand department store and a metamorphosis of American fashion.
Thank you. So, as an opening question, what first prompted your interest in the golden age of department retail stores? And maybe a second step of that question is, after you were interested in it, what made you decide to write a book about it?
Well, good questions. So I've always been sort of enamored by New York history. I grew up in New York, and kind of that world of nostalgia. And I a lot of writers think of a reader in mind when they're writing their books. And for me, it's my grandmother and my mother. So I have a lot of memories of shopping in these stores, and I, have felt their disappearance. And that was interesting to me. I had written, my first book was about the Plaza Hotel, and my agent was recommending that maybe I look at department stores, that could be a good idea. And I felt like I really wanted to focus on people rather than buildings. So I just began kind of investigating it, and I found in 2019, both Lord & Taylor and Bendel's closed within like a few weeks of each other, and the New York Times had this article where they mentioned Dorothy Shaver and Geraldine Stutz, and those are two of the women in my book. And I sort of became fascinated. They had never had biographies written about them. I'd never heard of them before. So I started investigating them, and then I stumbled on Hortense. And I felt like the three characters were just this like perfect way to kind of tell the story of the 20th century and of women and of fashion and, of the rise of the golden era of the department store.
What's different about writing about a building as opposed to writing about people? Because this could have been like the story of Lord & Taylor or any number of department stores, but it's not.
Yes, totally. And actually, my agent wanted me to write Store Wars about the stores. So exactly. It's much harder, I feel like, because I have a responsibility to tell the story of these women's lives. So a lot falls on me to be accurate and really try to find that narrative. Also, just creating a narrative is very different. With the Plaza, essentially every chapter is like a decade in the history of the hotel and how that reflects what was happening in New York and really America. And that's very different than following the lives of three people.
Can you talk about the process of researching the book? Speaking to maybe the families of these three women, or maybe going back and talking to the current owners and employees of the stores.
Yes.
How did the book come together?
Yes, exactly. So I am a reporter, journalist by trade. So, I started out, I didn't really, as I mentioned, the women never had biographies written about them. So I was a little nervous about how much information I could find. For Hortense, none of the women were Jewish in my three main characters, and Hortense was actually Mormon, and they care a lot about their genealogy. So she was from Utah, and I took a trip to Utah, and there's a pioneer museum there, and it had a huge plethora of information about her family, which was really fascinating. I used that. She also wrote a memoir in 1937, which was kind of a blessing and a curse because it was largely untrue. So as I have now realized, a lot of memoirs you must take with a grain of salt. And so I had to kind of figure out what was real and what wasn't, but it did give me an opportunity to sort of see a side of her. And then, I did a lot of newspaper research. For Dorothy, and also I interviewed her family. I found her grandchildren who were very helpful for me. Dorothy never had children, and she was much harder. She came from Mena, Arkansas, which is very different than New York. And I went to Mena, which was quite an experience, but I had a lot of trouble finding any living relatives. So I actually hired a genealogist who found her great niece, and it was like one of those amazing moments for a researcher because I called her up and she was like, yes, I have a basement filled with amazing archives and documents that no one's seen. So I spent a long time there, which was just a treasure trove. And she's the most famous of the women, and there is a bit of an archive in the Smithsonian of her papers, so I use that, and various other research archives. And then for Geraldine, I did kind of gumshoe reporting. She's the most recent of the three women. She died in 2005. So yes, there's a lot of current employees, former employees who are still alive who worked for her. And so I interviewed a lot of them and got amazing stories of what she was like as a boss and to work for. And I was also able to interview her nieces and nephews and her stepdaughter and stuff. So it was just sort of like a variety of traveling and archives and live interviews and family members.
So when you tried to get a sense of, and in a second I'm going to ask you just to give short synopsises of who these three women are so people get more of a sense of the context. But before I do that, the title of the book is When Women Ran Fifth Avenue. But even in the bit of prologue that you read, right, that's not really true because the stores were owned by men, even if the women were the ones that were doing the shopping and the buying and the outfitting and making it look the way that it looked. So maybe you could speak a little bit to the context that you discovered as far as what was actually going on in this period.
Yes, good point. That was a bit of creative license, I should say. Yes. What I like to say is that the men's names were on the building, but inside women ruled, and I felt like that is very accurate. The retail industry was largely employed by women in the 20th century, rather. Before that, people used to shop in general stores, in dry goods stores, and it was like you would go in, you'd have your shopping list, a male clerk, you almost always would go get your things, and you would haggle for a price, and then that was that. Department stores were a completely new way of shopping and of being a consumer. So they were nothing like what we think of today as in department stores. They were these enormous businesses that had 2,000 employees. They had zoos. They had dentist offices. Post offices were in these department stores. They had every kind of rug or mink coat or even bargain basement underwear that you could think of. It was just this like amalgam of glamour and glitz and variety. And inside, the women really were these powerful buyers. They were the saleswomen. They were really the machines that ran the store. And the men were largely the owners. So that was how that sort of worked. And that was a very different thing from the dry goods. Part of what I discovered and what was so exciting about this world was that these department stores were these incredible vehicles for women to have fulsome careers at a time when that was so rare. So it was, largely peopled by women, and, they were incredibly powerful in the 1910s, taking a boat to Paris to go to the fashion shows or running, departments with lots of people and large budgets. So, that was.
How did you decide who to focus on, right? You started out, you said earlier, you started out by finding two women that you were really, really interested in, and then you found a third. But there's other kind of side characters and other vignettes of other women that were involved in the industry as well. So what made you decide on the three that you wrote about? Yeah,
I mean, as I mentioned, there were so many amazing women that had incredible, powerful roles that were very unusual in that era. And I had a plethora of options. But when you're trying to figure out like a narrative for a book, I tried to limit it. I basically decided to pick three women that were presidents of the stores because that was so unusual and they were reaching the highest echelon of the store other than owner, even though two of the women were part owners eventually. But so that was part of my thinking. Also, you do care about research and what sort of material you have. So it really, since it's nonfiction, I wish sometimes it was a little fiction I could throw in there because that would be great. But I had to, only rely on the material I could find. And so I tried to find women that I felt like would have enough material about them. And because they were presidents, even though they're not famous now, now, and we've never heard of them. During their time running these businesses, they were quite well known. So there's a lot of newspaper coverage, other things like that helps me fill out the narrative.
So let's take a minute now, and then maybe you can give us like brief synopsises of the lives, right? We don't want people not to buy the book,
True.
right? So like in a teasy kind of way, like who are the three women that you're writing about?
Okay, so Hortense, who was part of the prologue, she was a mother. She came from a very a pioneer town in Utah. She came to New York. Her husband was very rich, and in 1934 she became president of Bonwit Teller. It's a whole adventure on how that happened, which is in the book. She became the first woman to ever be president of a major Fifth Avenue department store, probably department store period in America. It was, amazing. It was the height of the Depression. The store was basically bankrupt, and she completely turned the business around. She ended up having quite complicated feelings about her career, and I explore that, and it led to, she was a mom and, struggles with work-life balance. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to. Dorothy Shaver, she came to New York City in 1919 from Arkansas, as I mentioned, which was a year before women, even earned the right to vote. She came with her younger sister, Elsie. They really just had a suitcase between them. And by 1924, she had gotten a job in Lord & Taylor, and by 1945, she had become president of the store. Life magazine named her America's #1 career woman. She earned the highest published salary that we know of in that era. It was about like $1.5 million a year, and she was a powerhouse, and she really helped establish the American fashion industry, and a lot of that I get into. And the final woman was Geraldine Stutz, who was hired as the president of Bendel's in 1959. She was a young fashion editor. She was 33. She was very beautiful. She, everyone doubted her. She was single. Again, she proved everyone wrong. She turned Bendel's around in the 1960s and 70s. It was the chicest place to shop. I mean, where everyone from Mick Jagger to, Babe Paley would go shopping, and that was largely because of her. And I trace her life until the mid-'80s, basically, and that's where the book sort of ends.
I'm wondering for yourself, as you were writing the book and you were researching these stories, did you have a certain sense as you got into the project of what it was going to look like, and how did the book change by the end?
Oh, wow, yeah.
Right, I'm sure it changed a lot.
Yes, it did change a lot.
Instead of asking, did it change, I'm going to ask you how it changed.
Wow, okay, that's hard. So to write a nonfiction book, you don't write the whole book before you get a book deal. You write a proposal, which essentially is a sample chapter, so one chapter of the book, and then your sort of like summaries of what you think all the chapters will be. And you write this before you've done all the research, so it's what you think it's going to be. So I didn't really know what I would find with these women's lives. So I wrote much more. I think I thought it would be actually much less about their lives and much more about the stores in some ways. And it is very much about the stores, but I use them, I think, to great effect as a vehicle to tell that story. And it's less like necessarily just about the stores themselves. Yeah, and also these vignettes, these side characters. So as I was doing all this research, I started finding these incredible stories that I really wanted to include that weren't directly related to their three lives. So for instance, I have a vignette about a girl who in 1906 got a job in a large department store in San Francisco, and she was just like a junior dust girl. She dusted the china there, and by 1917 she was a really powerful buyer. She had moved her family out of a tenement in the Mission District to a home across the bay, and I wanted to tell her story and how that could have happened in these kind of decades where you don't even think that women had those kind of roles. So that's an example of something I didn't think that I would include or know of, beforehand.
As you were writing these stories and as you were researching the book, were there like specific parts where you were able to like really easily relate and say, oh, I know exactly what that feels like? And were there other moments where you kind of saw something and you said, there's no way I can even wrap my mind around what that was like?
Yeah, definitely. I'll take the latter first. Hortense really regretted having a job and felt like it led to a lot of sadness in her life, in her personal life. And she actually became, like very vociferous, anti-working woman. And that was very challenging for me to kind of like relate to as a modern working woman. So that was very hard to kind of wrap my head around. Also, like the world of these department stores were so crazy. Like one thing I found was like the craziest they would do these publicity stunts. There was a store that actually had like an adoption week where they put 9 babies up for adoption and they found homes for 6 of them. So, things like that where I was like, what? That's part of a department store publicity stunt, So things like that. In terms of like really relating, I guess Geraldine, since she's the most modern of the women, I felt a lot of affinity for her. She's sort of my mom's generation, and I could kind of feel what her life was like in terms of her romances and her professional life. So I felt a lot of like affinity for her journey. And, I felt a lot of like what people go through in the working world as women. I also felt a lot of affinity just in general about that, so.
There's a lot of like celebrity and glamour in the book also, and that was the culture. So in the book, you find like Jackie Onassis, you find Salvador Dali, Andy Warhol. What was like the coolest story, like side story?
Okay, yeah.
Doesn't really relate directly to these 3 women,
yeah,
but just
for sure.
really says a lot about the culture and the era.
Yeah, so you mentioned Salvador Dali. So these stores were almost like museums in many times, and their store windows, artists like Georgia O'Keeffe or Salvador Dali would do these window displays, and they were incredible. And I found this story about Salvador Dali did, obviously he's a very surrealist artist and it's very strange, a lot of his things. So Bonwit Teller had him do this window in the 1930s, and he made this crazy window where it was supposed to be like a Greek myth, and the models, the mannequins were dressed very provocatively with hands coming out of a bathtub, and it was all kinds of crazy stuff. And everyone in the store was like, this is insane. It doesn't have anything to do with the store or fashion. And so they changed it. And he had worked all night on these windows and went and took a nap. And when he got up in the afternoon, he went to go see his windows, and he found that they had been changed. And he became so enraged that he entered the window, and he took that bathtub and he threw it out the Fifth Avenue window onto the street. And he actually fell through the window too onto the street where all the glass was. And it happened to be that some policemen were walking by. They arrested him. He had to spend the night in night court. These are the kind of crazy things that, happened. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff like that I could get into.
You'll give us another one.
Okay, I don't know, yeah.
That's hard to tell.
I know, right? It's true. I was thinking about mannequins. There was like this guy who made all the mannequins. He was kind of famous. Lester Gaba was his name, and his mannequins were called the Gaba Girls, and he became this like thing in the 1940s, and he would actually take his mannequins with him to like the El Morocco nightclub, or he took them to the wedding of the king who abdicated, and married, I've forgotten her name, but the famous wedding, he like brought this mannequin with him. There were pictures and like newspapers of him hanging out. Actually, she had I think House and Garden did a whole feature about her as if she was a real person, this one mannequin that he liked to bring with him. So it was, I don't know, bizarre stories, very funny.
So here's maybe take a step back kind of question. So you had mentioned earlier that none of the 3 women that you really focused on were Jewish, and as I was reading the book, I had to double check because it's not always very clear exactly who or where. So I Googled just to see are they Jewish, and I was kind of surprised almost to find out that they weren't, because there's such a tradition of Jews in retail and a Jewish influence in the garment industry. And I'm just wondering kind of what's the Jewish angle to this book, because there clearly is a Jewish influence in the culture there.
Yes, there absolutely was, and a lot of the owners were Jewish and Jewish families, and there were many Jewish women who did work in the stores. I do have a section where I highlight some of them because I felt like sad that it's like a Mormon, lapsed Catholic, and an Episcopal are the three women my main, and I'm Jewish, so I felt, so actually there's some incredible Jewish women that, like I mentioned Beatrice Fox Auerbach for a second. So she, I don't know if anyone has watched Mad Men, but one of Don Draper's, paramours was Rachel Menken, and she was actually based on a real person. She was Menken's department store in the TV show, if any of you know. And actually, I guess some people think she was actually like Don Draper's one true love. And she was Jewish and single, and she ran her father's department store after he had died. And that's exactly the case with Beatrice Fox Auerbach. She ran G. Fox's in Hartford. After her father died, she was a single Jewish woman, mom, and she was an incredibly pioneering person. She was, she didn't fire a single person during the Great Depression, which was incredibly unusual. She was one of the first department stores in 1942 to hire black people as saleswomen and salesmen in the front of the store, things like that. She was incredible. Also, I don't know, like people have heard of Lane Bryant, the clothing store. That was started by Lena Himmelstein. She was an amazing person who, a bank clerk actually spelled her name wrong, and she decided to go with it, and that's how we got to Lane Bryant. She wasn't technically a department store, but I do include her story. And like iMagnin is another one. Actually, iMagnin, which is a department store in San Francisco, was started by the daughter of a rabbi, a Jewish woman who had like 10 kids, but she named it after her husband, Isaac Magnin. So that's why it's iMagnin. So yeah. But there is a whole culture, obviously, and you mentioned the garment district. I mean, I do talk a little bit about the relationship between the department stores and the garment district. It's not exactly apples to apples, because that was really the manufacturing arm, and this was more the front office, if you will, of the business. But yeah.
What do you think is the current, like 2024, right, the cultural legacy of this entire era of big retail? Like looking back, you've told the stories of these three women and the era in which they lived. Like kind of where do we see, residue of that influence nowadays in the world of Amazon and Walmart?
I think that, I don't know. I think people's maybe consumer habits are very different now. They don't necessarily go to stores to experience have this experiential, moment. They just go and they know what they want, or they can find it on Amazon. They look it up. It's much more convenient. It's a very different thing. I think you lose something because you don't have that discovery that we used to have, where you wander into a store and find something you never knew you wanted, and there it is. And, that whole experience has sort of been lost. But I mean, I do think on the other hand, it's sort of been democratized, retail, because anyone who wants to start a business can just start selling T-shirts on Instagram. It has opened up that sort of thing. So in that way, I think it's been maybe positive, but I don't know what if there's really a legacy today.
It's mixed, basically.
Yeah.
As a final question from me before we take questions and answers from the audience, what do you think would be like the takeaway messages or lessons or questions when somebody reads the book, besides just the sense of the history if they didn't know it? What do you want them to take away from the book? I mean, I hope that it evokes memories for people who lived through those eras, and they can have fond remembrances of maybe people they went shopping with or shopping themselves. Also, I feel like, for me personally, one of the things that was most impactful was this idea that women were doing so much before I really understood that they, I know of the modern women's movement in the 60s and 70s, late 60s, but I didn't realize in the 1910s, women were kind of having the same discussions. I found these old articles, for instance. One was from 1932 in Good Housekeeping, and it was marriage or career. And to me, that's just very interesting that they interviewed all these women to ask them if they thought you could have both. And, that's 1932. We're having the same discussion. So for me, that was very fascinating to see that kind of continuum and that sort of sisterhood. And,
you know, just being able to have a moment where you can appreciate that time in New York history and, yeah, the glamour and the stories, all of that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.